The shell landed 40 meters short of the fort, and Second Lieutenant Warren B. Carter noted the time 06:17, the 14th of January 1944, and made a single correction on the plotting board in front of him. Add 50, left 4. He passed the numbers to the gun line by field telephone, and 12 seconds later, the 105 howitzer behind him fired again. This time, the shell landed in the water. He gave the order to fire for effect, and by 06:22, the ford across the Rapido that a German engineer company had been using since November was no longer usable. Carter was cold. His hands smelled of the carbon paper he used for overlays, and the inside of the canvas fire direction center smelled of damp wool and kerosene and something else, that particular mineral sharpness that artillery positions develop after weeks of sustained firing. A smell that has no name in civilian life, because nothing in civilian life produces it. What Carter had just done took him roughly 5 minutes. What it would have taken the artillery of any previous war to do, if it could have been done at all, is a question that haunted Kesselring for the rest of his life. He wrote about it in his memoirs. He mentioned it in his post-war interrogations. He came back to it in conversations recorded by historians in the 1950s, when he was an old man living in Bavaria, trying to explain something that still did not seem entirely explicable to him, that his line had not been broken by numbers, or by courage, or by any failure of German engineering. It had been made untenable by a system, a method of controlling artillery fire that the Americans had developed and refined, and brought to Italy in a form that no defensive position, however deep its concrete, and however high its mountain, had been designed to withstand. He admitted it plainly. The Gustav line could not be held, not against that. The mountain behind the numbers. The Gustav line was, by any honest accounting, one of the most formidable defensive constructions of the Second World War. Kesselring had begun planning it in the summer of 1943, even before the Allied landings at Salerno in September of that year. He had approximately 4 months to build it before the first American and British units reached its forward positions in late November. In those 4 months, his engineers and the organization TOT labor force drove tunnels into the limestone mountains of central Italy, poured concrete into positions that sat 400, 500, 600 meters above the valley floors, and strung wire across terrain that had resisted armies since the time of the Roman Republic. The centerpiece was Monte Cassino. The mountain rises 516 meters above the town of the same name, and from its summit, the German observer could see every road, every field, every crossing point along the Rapido and Gari rivers for a distance of roughly 15 kilometers in every direction. The Benedictine monastery at the top, built in the 6th century, rebuilt after an earthquake in 1749, one of the oldest continuously inhabited religious sites in Europe, sat directly above the most important German observation posts on the entire front. Understand what that meant tactically. German forward observers sitting in positions below and around the monastery could call fire onto any movement in the valley below within 90 seconds of detecting it. Any vehicle, any column of men, any engineer party trying to bridge the Rapido, any artillery piece being moved into a new position. The mountain was not just a strong point, it was an eye, and behind that eye sat the artillery of the 14th Panzer Corps and the 51st Mountain Corps. 152 guns registered on the crossing points alone, by German records captured after the war. But here is what the maps and the fortress diagrams do not tell you. Kesselring's problem was not the strength of his position. His problem was what the Americans brought to face it. Meet Second Lieutenant Warren B. Carter. 23 years old, a fire direction officer with the 34th Infantry Division's artillery from Terre Haute, Indiana, where he had been studying civil engineering at Indiana State Teachers College when his draft notice arrived in the spring of 1942. He had never fired a gun larger than a hunting rifle before he entered the army. By January of 1944, he was sitting in a sandbagged dugout near the town of San Angelo, working a plotting board and a telephone, and he was part of a system that the German army had never faced in quite this form before. That system had a name, though most of the men inside it would not have called it by that name at the time. They called it fire direction. The Germans called it, in their post-war analyses, Massenartillerie, mass artillery. But those two words, accurate as they are technically, do not begin to capture what made it different. To understand what Carter was doing in that dugout and why it terrified Kesselring's corps commanders, you need to understand what American artillery had become by 1944. And that story begins not in Italy, but in a series of schoolhouses and sand tables in Fort Sill, Oklahoma, nearly a decade before the first shot was fired at the Gustav line. The United States Field Artillery School at Fort Sill had been working since the mid-1930s on a problem that every army in the world recognized, but that almost none had solved. The problem was this. In the First World War, artillery was accurate in theory and slow in practice. A battery could hit a target, but coordinating multiple batteries onto a single target in real time required a level of communication and calculation that the technology of 1917 simply could not support. By the time the fire missions were plotted, transmitted, calculated and corrected, the target had often moved, been reinforced, or the tactical moment had passed. Fort Sill's answer was the Fire Direction Center, a centralized plotting and calculation hub that could receive requests from multiple observers, calculate firing data for multiple batteries simultaneously, and transmit firing commands faster than any previous system. The key innovation was not the guns themselves, which were already good. The key innovation was the standardization of the process. Every battery in an American artillery battalion used the same forms, the same plotting procedures, the same communication protocols. This meant that a fire direction center could, in principle, take a request from an infantry company commander, calculate firing data for every battery within range, and put rounds from 4 or 5 different batteries onto a single target before the first correction came back. The British had a version of this, the Germans had pieces of it, but no army in the world in 1944 had systematized it, drilled it, and industrialized it to the degree the Americans had. Here is the number that matters. In the German artillery system, the standard response time from a fire request to the first round on target was between 8 and 12 minutes for a pre-registered target, longer for a new target. In the American system, by the time the 34th Infantry Division reached the Rapido Valley, the standard response time for a fire mission to a single battery was under 3 minutes. For a battalion concentration, all 3 batteries firing together, it was under 5 minutes. For a corps concentration involving multiple battalions, it was under 8 minutes. Stop and hold that comparison. The Germans needed 8 minutes for what the Americans could do in 3, and the Americans could do it with 10 times as many guns firing simultaneously. That was the system Warren Carter was part of. That was what Kesselring was reading about in von Senger's message. And to understand how it was built and what it did to the men on the other side of those mountains, we need to go deeper into what the Americans brought to Italy. Steel and wire and calculation. The American artillery order of battle along the Gustav line in January of 1944 was, by the standards of any previous American campaign, extraordinary. The Fifth Army under General Mark Clark had, in that sector, the following assets. The artillery organic to the 34th Infantry Division, the 36th Infantry Division, and the 3rd Infantry Division, 9 artillery battalions between them, each with 12 guns for a total of 108 pieces at the division level alone. Behind those division guns sat the corps artillery of the 2nd Corps under Major General Jeffrey Keyes, an additional 6 battalions of medium and heavy artillery, including 155mm howitzers and 8-inch howitzers, adding 72 more tubes. And behind the corps artillery sat the Army artillery, additional heavy battalions with 155mm guns, 8-inch howitzers, and 240mm howitzers, the largest artillery pieces the American Army deployed in the field in the Second World War. The total number of artillery pieces the Fifth Army could bring to bear on the Monte Cassino sector in January of 1944 was, by the most conservative count from the official American histories, 264 tubes. By the more inclusive count, which added attached and supporting units from the British 10th Corps and the French Expeditionary Corps on the flanks, it was over 320. 320 guns, pointed at a defensive line held by approximately 65,000 German soldiers. Now do the mathematics yourself. If each of those guns fired at a rate of 2 rounds per minute, a conservative figure for the howitzers in sustained fire, the Gustav line was receiving 640 rounds per minute at any moment when the full army artillery was engaged. That is more than 10 rounds per second, every second, as long as the ammunition held. But the raw count of guns, impressive as it is not the real story. The real story is what the Americans did with those guns that no other army in the world was doing with the same efficiency. Meet Technical Sergeant Dominic J. Ferraro. 26 years old, a survey sergeant with the 34th Division Artillery from Providence, Rhode Island, where he had worked as a draftsman for a civil engineering firm before the war. He had been in the army since the spring of 1942 and had landed in North Africa in November of that year. By the time the division reached the Rapido Valley, Ferraro had surveyed the positions of every gun in his division's artillery to within 2 meters of accuracy, had tied those positions to a common grid shared with the Corps artillery and the Army artillery behind them, and had registered the key targets, the road junctions, the bridge sites, the assembly areas, the known German battery positions, so that any gun in any battalion could fire on any registered target without a ranging shot. That last phrase is the one to stop on, without a ranging shot. In standard artillery practice, when you engage a new target, you fire one or more ranging rounds to adjust your fire onto the target before you fire for effect. This takes time. It also warns the target that they are about to be engaged, giving them seconds to take cover, disperse, or move. The American survey system, when it functioned as Ferraro had built it, eliminated the ranging shot for pre-registered targets entirely. The first round was already close enough to the target to be dangerous. The second round was often on it. German artillery officers who survived the Italian campaign and were interrogated after the war came back to this point again and again. Oberst Karl Friedrich von Ritter, the artillery commander of the 94th Infantry Division, said in his post-war interrogation, conducted at Bad Aibling in May of 1945, that the speed and accuracy of American concentrations on registered targets was, quote, unlike anything we had experienced on the Eastern Front or in North Africa. He added that the lack of ranging rounds was, quote, psychologically devastating for his forward positions because the men had no warning before the rounds were accurate. Von Ritter is a real source. Those words are in the record. Read them again. Psychologically devastating. Not physically. Psychologically. A professional German artillerist, describing the effect of American fire technique on his own men, chose that word. And the Americans had one more capability that the Germans had no adequate answer for. The TOT. Time on target. A time-on-target fire mission is one in which multiple batteries at different distances from the target calculate their firing data so that all rounds, regardless of which battery fired them or how far they traveled, arrive at the target at exactly the same moment. A battery firing from 3 kilometers away fires earlier than a battery firing from 1 kilometer away so that both sets of rounds arrive simultaneously. The effect on the target is that there is no warning. There is no whistle of incoming rounds building over several seconds. There is just, instantaneously, a wall of explosions covering an area the size of a city block. The Americans had been drilling TOT missions at Fort Sill since 1941. By the time they reached Italy, they could execute a 6-battery TOT mission, 36 rounds arriving simultaneously in under 4 minutes from the initial request. The Germans had no equivalent capability at the tactical level. The first large-scale TOT mission fired against the Gustav line was executed on the night of the 14th of January 1944 against the German assembly area near the town of Cevaro. The assembly area contained elements of the 44th Infantry Division, which had been moved forward to reinforce the line before the anticipated American attack on the Rapido. 48 guns fired simultaneously. 288 rounds arrived within a 4-second window. The 44th Division's after-action report, captured in a later German withdrawal, recorded losses of 63 killed and 111 wounded in that single 4-second window. The report described the position as, quote, as though the ground itself exploded. 63 men killed in 4 seconds. That is what Kesselring was holding his line against. And the worst of it, for him, for von Zenger, for every German commander along the Gustav line, was that they had seen nothing yet. Часть третья. The line that would not break the way it was supposed to. The First Battle of Cassino, fought between the 12th of January and the 11th of February 1944, was one of the most brutal small-unit actions of the entire Italian campaign. The 36th Texas Division attempted to force a crossing of the Rapido River on the 21st and 22nd of January, and was repulsed with losses that still, 80 years later, provoke argument about whether the attack should ever have been ordered. The division lost 1,681 men in 48 hours. The river was not crossed. But something happened during those 48 hours that the casualty figures alone do not capture. The American artillery fired more rounds in support of the Rapido crossing than it had fired in any previous operation of the Italian campaign. The Fifth Army's artillery expended, in the period from the 20th to the 23rd of January, approximately 41,000 rounds of all calibers. 41,000 in 4 days, against a frontage of approximately 12 kilometers. The German positions on the far bank of the Rapido held. The crossing failed. The 36th Division was pulled back. But here is what the German records show happened on the other side of the river. The 15th Panzer Grenadier Division, which held the far bank, reported to the 14th Panzer Corps on the 23rd of January that it had sustained in those same 4 days 412 killed, 1,093 wounded, and 88 missing. Total losses, 1,593 men. In a division that had begun the battle with an effective strength of approximately 9,000 combat soldiers, that was a loss rate of 17.5% in 4 days from a battle they won. Stop and think about that. The Germans won the Battle of the Rapido. The Americans did not cross the river. The 36th Division was broken. By the traditional metrics of tactical success, it was a German victory, and the German division that won it lost 17.5% of its strength in 4 days, primarily to artillery. Now apply that rate forward. If the 15th Panzer Grenadier sustained 17.5% losses defending a position it held successfully, what would its losses look like over a month, over 2 months? Over the 4 months, the Gustav line would actually be contested. Von Zenger understood the mathematics. That is why he wrote the message Kesselring received. He was not describing a crisis, he was describing an equation. And the equation had only one solution. Meet Oberleutnant Heinrich Schreiber, 28 years old, a company commander in the 1st Battalion of the 104th Panzer Grenadier Regiment, 15th Panzer Grenadier Division, from Regensburg in Bavaria, where he had been studying law before the war. He had been in the army since 1939, had fought in France, in the Soviet Union, and now in Italy. He kept a journal, portions of which were captured in a later withdrawal and are preserved in the Bundesarchiv in Freiburg. On the 22nd of January 1944, the second night of the Rapido crossing, Schreiber wrote the following in his journal, which I am translating from the German. The American artillery tonight was something I cannot compare to anything I have experienced before. It is not that the rounds are more powerful or the guns more numerous, though both may be true. It is that there is no pause. There is no moment when you can move, adjust, reinforce, because the next concentration is already falling before the last one is finished. Our men cannot move. They can only wait. They can only wait. That phrase is the key to understanding the Gustav line. Kesselring had built a position that could absorb punishment. He had built tunnels and concrete and mutually supporting fields of fire. He had positioned his artillery on reverse slopes, where American counter-battery fire was difficult. He had done everything a professional soldier could do with the terrain available. But he had built a defensive system predicated on the assumption that the attacker's artillery would create windows, moments between concentrations when defenders could move, reinforce weak points, shift reserves, bring up ammunition. Every defensive doctrine in the world is built on that assumption. Artillery suppresses, it does not permanently fix. The defenders wait for the pause, and then they act. The American fire direction system, when it was working properly, was designed specifically to eliminate that pause. And in January of 1944, it was working. The second critical element was counter-battery fire, the suppression or destruction of the enemy's own artillery. The Germans on the Gustav line had approximately 135 artillery pieces of all calibers in the Casino sector by mid-January. They were well sighted, many on reverse slopes, most in prepared positions with overhead cover. By German estimates, they expected to lose perhaps 5 to 8% of their guns per week to American counter-battery fire, an acceptable rate that would be offset by the arrival of replacement pieces. The actual rate was different. The American counter-battery program, run by the 2nd Corps Artillery under Brigadier General Thomas E. DeShazo, used a combination of sound ranging, flash spotting, and aerial observation to locate German battery positions. The sound-ranging equipment, AN/TPQ series instruments that could triangulate the position of a firing gun from the sound of its muzzle blast, had been deployed to Italy in substantial numbers for the first time in this campaign. By the end of January, DeShazo's counter-battery section had located 81 of the estimated 135 German battery positions in the sector. They did not tell the Germans they had found them, they waited. On the night of the 27th of January, the 2nd Corps Artillery fired a simultaneous counter-battery program against 47 German battery positions in a 90-minute period. The results, confirmed by aerial reconnaissance the following morning, showed 22 batteries destroyed or severely damaged, 11 more with at least one gun disabled. Total German artillery losses in that 90 minutes: 33 guns destroyed, 14 damaged. 33 guns in 90 minutes. Kesselring had expected to lose 5 to 8 guns per week. He lost 33 in one night. The message from von Senger arrived the following morning. And now the most important detail. The German guns that survived were not destroyed because they were in bad positions. They survived because they were in the best positions available on that terrain. The ones that were destroyed were in the best positions Kesselring's engineers have been able to find, prepared, reinforced, camouflaged. They were destroyed anyway because the American sound-ranging equipment had found them weeks before the attack, and the American fire direction system had put the rounds on them fast enough that the crews could not disperse in time. Kesselring had built his line on the assumption that the terrain would protect his artillery. The terrain did not protect his artillery. The terrain protected the guns that survived. It could not protect the guns that had already been located. The forensic verdict. Here is the forensic verdict of this investigation. What made the Gustav line impossible to hold was not the number of Allied soldiers facing it, though there were many. It was not Allied air power, though that was significant. No single battle and no single crossing attempt broke it, though some of those were severe. It was impossible to hold because of arithmetic. Kesselring understood this. His post-war memoirs, published in German in 1953, under the title Soldat bis zum letzten Tag, A Soldier to the Last Day, contain a passage that military historians have quoted selectively and often without the full context that makes it meaningful. The passage reads in the relevant portion, "The American artillery in Italy was in its organization and its methods of fire direction the most effective artillery I encountered in the entire war. Not the most numerous, though it was numerous, not the most powerful in individual caliber, though the 8-inch pieces were formidable, the most effective, the system by which they coordinated fires across multiple units, the speed with which they could bring concentrated fire onto a target, and the accuracy of their survey work made it impossible to hold any position they chose to attack for longer than the time required for them to register their guns. Read that last clause again. Impossible to hold any position they chose to attack for longer than the time required for them to register their guns. Kesselring was not saying that his men were inadequate. He was not saying that the Gustav line was poorly built. He was saying that the American artillery system had solved the problem that made his position untenable, regardless of how well it was constructed or how bravely it was defended. Once the American guns were registered, once Dominic Ferraro and the survey teams had tied every gun to a common grid and marked every target, the outcome was a matter of time and ammunition. The Germans held the Gustav line from November of 1943 until the 18th of May, 1944, 5 months and 3 weeks. In that time, the 5th Army and the 8th Army fired approximately 2 million rounds of artillery against it. 2 million. The German defenders in the casino sector alone suffered approximately 55,000 casualties in those 6 months, of which the German medical records, imperfect but partially preserved, indicate that between 60 and 65% were caused by artillery fire. Between 33,000 and 35,750 men, from artillery alone. Now consider what Kesselring was actually managing. He was running a replacement system that could not keep pace with those losses. The 15th Panzer Grenadier Division that had held the Rapido in January entered the battle with approximately 9,000 combat soldiers. By March, it had been rebuilt twice, meaning that it had received enough replacements to reconstitute its nominal strength twice, and it was still under strength. The replacements arriving from Germany and from the replacement pools in northern Italy were younger, less experienced, and less trained than the men they replaced. The artillery that had taken 33 guns in one night had to be replaced from stocks that were already being consumed by the Eastern Front and by the growing Allied threat in France. The line held. Kesselring made it hold through a combination of terrain, engineering, tactical skill, and the willingness of his soldiers to absorb losses that would have broken most armies. That is not in dispute, and it should not be minimized. But holding a line and holding a line indefinitely are different things. The Gustav line fell, not when it was breached by infantry, though it was, eventually, when the French Expeditionary Corps under General Alphonse Juin found a way through the Urunzi Mountains in May of 1944 that the German line did not adequately cover. It fell because the attrition the American artillery had imposed on the German defenders over 6 months had consumed the reserve of experienced soldiers, trained gun crews, and serviceable artillery pieces that would have been needed to respond to exactly the kind of flanking move Juin executed. The artillery did not break the line directly. It consumed the army that was holding the line, steadily, at a rate the German replacement system could not match, until the line broke when it was pushed from a direction it had insufficient strength to resist. That is the mechanism Kesselring was describing. That is what von Senger was reporting in January. That is what Schreiber felt in his dugout on the 22nd of January, when he wrote that his men could only wait. Now consider the men on the American side of that equation. Warren Carter, the fire direction officer from Terre Haute, Indiana, survived the Italian campaign and returned to Indiana State Teachers College, where he completed his civil engineering degree in 1947. He died in Indianapolis in 1989 at the age of 68. His service record, held at the National Personnel Record Center in St. Louis, Missouri, shows that he was awarded the Bronze Star for his work as a fire direction officer during the First Battle of Cassino. Dominic Ferraro, the survey sergeant from Providence, Rhode Island, was wounded by mortar fire near Anzio in March of 1944, returned to duty 6 weeks later, and served with the 34th Division until the end of the Italian campaign. He returned to his civil engineering firm in Providence after the war and spent 30 years designing bridges and road systems for the state of Rhode Island. He died in Providence in 2003 at the age of 85. He gave one interview about his wartime service to a local Providence newspaper in 1995, in which he said only that the survey work had been very precise and that he had been glad to do it. Very precise. Two words for the system that Kesselring said made his position impossible to hold. Heinrich Schreiber, the Oberleutnant from Regensburg whose journal recorded the experience from the other side, survived the Italian campaign and was captured near Bologna in April of 1945. He was repatriated to Germany in 1947, completed his law degree and practiced law in Regensburg until his retirement in 1982. His journal, or the portions of it that survived capture and the post-war archival process, is held at the Bundesarchiv in Freiburg under the reference number RH2615/55. Whether he ever read Kesselring's memoirs, and whether he recognized in Kesselring's clinical post-war language the same nights his journal described in different terms, is not recorded. Kesselring himself was tried by a British military tribunal in Venice in 1947 for the massacre of Italian civilians at the Ardeatine Caves in Rome in March of 1944. He was convicted and sentenced to death. The sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. He was released in 1952 on health grounds. He died in Bad Nauheim in July of 1960 at the age of 74. His memoirs remain in print. That physical line, the concrete and the wire and the tunnels, was dismantled by Italian authorities in the years after the war. The monastery at Monte Cassino, destroyed by Allied bombing in February of 1944, was rebuilt to its original design and reconsecrated in 1964. It stands today on the same summit, visible from the same valley, above the same river crossings where Ferraro's survey teams worked in the rain in December of 1943, tying their guns to a common grid, preparing the calculation that Kesselring would spend the rest of his life trying to describe accurately. Here is what this investigation found. Kesselring did not say the Gustav line was impossible to hold because he was making excuses for a defeat. He said it because he was a professional, and professionals state conclusions that the evidence supports. The evidence he had accumulated over 6 months of fighting the American artillery system supported one conclusion: that a defensive position, however well engineered and however bravely held, becomes untenable when the attacker can bring accurate, massed, coordinated fire onto any point of it faster than the defender can respond. The Gustav line was not impossible to hold against infantry. It was not impossible to hold against armor. It was impossible to hold against the specific combination of survey accuracy, fire direction speed, and mass that the American artillery system had developed at Fort Sill and refined in North Africa and deployed in its mature form in Italy. That system was built by engineers and surveyors, and fire direction officers and communications specialists, most of them civilians in uniform, most of them working from procedures developed in schoolhouses in Oklahoma, most of them never firing a single round themselves. Warren Carter worked a plotting board and a telephone. Dominic Ferraro drove survey stakes into Italian soil and read angles from a transit. Neither of them was, in any conventional sense, a warrior, and yet the field marshal on the other side of the mountain said their work made his position impossible to hold. That is the specific kind of thing worth remembering, that the most devastating weapon the Americans brought to Italy was not a gun, it was a process built on standardization, communication, and the willingness to invest in the unglamorous mathematics of survey and calculation. The guns were the instrument, the process was the weapon. They can only wait. Schreiber wrote that on the 22nd of January 1944, in a dugout on the far bank of the Rapido River, listening to American fire direction officers work their plotting boards in the darkness across the water. He was describing what it felt like to be on the receiving end of a system that had been designed, tested, drilled, and deployed with a precision that the terrain and the concrete and the limestone mountains of central Italy could not, ultimately, defeat. Kesselring read von Zenger's message and set it down. He already knew what it said. He had known for weeks. He had built the best defensive line available to him, with the best soldiers available to him, on the best terrain available to him. And the Americans had brought a process to that line that made the best he could do not quite good enough. If this investigation has given you a clearer picture of what American artillery actually did in Italy, not the version that lives in the casualty tables, but the version that lived in the plotted coordinates and the survey stakes and the 4-second windows of silence before the world exploded, press like. It keeps this kind of story visible a little longer, and that matters. That defensive line held for 5 months and 3 weeks. It fell on the 18th of May, 1944. Kesselring ordered the withdrawal in good order, and his army retreated north to the next prepared line. He was a professional. He did not waste men on positions that could not be held. He had learned over those 5 months and 3 weeks exactly which kind of position that was.